One of my good buddies is in the process of moving from Adobe XD over to Figma, and as he's been making that transition, he's been asking me quite a few questions about how to do things inside of Figma. Now, I'm not a Figma expert, but I do spend quite a bit of time in there, and I've really enjoyed showing him some of the different tips and tricks that are packed into Figma that make it my favorite design tool. Over the course of time, I've ended up sending him a lot of different little tutorials, and I figured this might be useful to more people out there, so I've decided today to put together a video with some of my favorite tips and tricks for using Figma. This is far from being a comprehensive tutorial on the software, but think of it more as a crash course on some of the really key features that might not be obvious the first time you use Figma. If you're making the transition over to Figma or interested in getting started, then stick around and let's check it out. So the first thing I want to talk about is auto layouts. This is one of my favorite features inside Figma, and it really makes it to where you're almost using Flexbox here inside your design tool. So let's take a look at a couple examples of how that works. The first thing I'm going to do is create a button. So for this button, I'm going to have text. We'll bump this up to maybe 18 pixels. And behind that button, I need to add some kind of rectangle. So I'll go ahead and just draw that out and put it behind the text. Now I'm just going to manually kind of size this out to get it to an appropriate size for a button. And then I can grab this and make sure that it's centered both vertically and horizontally. We'll go ahead and give this a more contrasting color just so it's easy to see on the screen. And with that, we pretty much have our button done. Now you could go ahead and just group this, and anytime you need a button, find this one that you made, copy it, and paste it into your design. But I promise you, you're going to run into some limitations with this. First of all, let's just imagine this first one said button, but the next one said call us today. Well, you can see now this button is actually, the text is overflowing the background of the button, which obviously isn't how a button on a website behaves. So this is where auto layout comes in and can really save the day. I'm going to delete this example and we'll go back to our first one here. And here I'm going to press this plus button on auto layout. What this is going to do is create this button as a frame, and it's going to give us some auto layout controls. Most importantly, it's going to give us settings for horizontal and vertical padding. So now we could set this to something like 32 pixels of horizontal padding and 12 pixels of vertical padding. And when we duplicate this button and we say call us today, you can see the button automatically resizes to keep its proportions with this text. Basically, since we've set these values of horizontal and vertical padding, it's maintaining those as we change the text, just like it would on your website. So you definitely wouldn't want to create buttons here inside of Figma unless you're using an auto layout. If you think that was cool, we're really just getting started. Next, let's talk about how we can use this component, this button, inside a bigger system like a navigation. I'm going to delete this second example. We'll go back to this first, and we'll just call this Get Started. What I'm going to do is build out a navigation for our website. So we have our Get Started link. We might have a home link. We might have services. And let's say we have about. So we can use those same controls up here to go ahead and make sure that these items are distributed evenly horizontally and that they're centered vertically. So this looks like a pretty good start to a menu. But what if the client comes and changes some of this text? So instead of services, he wants to change this to our services. Now, we've changed the length of this text, so now it's actually running into our about. They're not evenly spaced anymore. So again, we need to grab all this. We need to go back and distribute it evenly. But now the gap between our different menu items has changed, so we might have to go back here and start spacing these out again and go through that process again. But thankfully, auto layout can save us here as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all of these menu items, and again, I'm going to press this plus button next to the auto layout. Actually, what I use is the command Shift A, which creates an auto layout automatically. Now, instead of padding's really not going to be applicable here to this menu. What we're going to be looking at is horizontal gap between items. You can see it's already measured out that we have 31 pixels, but now we can change that. So we might say, hey, let's just have 24 pixels in between our items. Now, if we can change this to services from our services, and you can see it's maintained that 24 pixels in between all of our items. Not only that, but we could grab some of these items and move them around the menu however we want, and it's going to make sure to maintain all the parameters we've set up. But we can actually take this a layer deeper and create our entire header using an auto layout. Let's zoom out here for a moment and we'll create a logo for this fake company. We're just going to say their logo is a round red circle, and maybe we'll give it a little bit of extra style with a nice black stroke. Okay, so we're going to have to set up this navigation so that the logo is all the way over here on the left and all the menu is way over on the right. So again, we're going to use auto layout. I'm going to go ahead and select all of this and press Shift A to create another auto layout. Now by default, it's making the width of this frame hug the sizes of the content. So essentially it didn't move the content around. It just measured how much space was between these two things, the navigation menu and the logo, and just put it in here as the space between. But we actually want to change that behavior and take advantage of some more features inside auto layout. Instead of hug for the width, we're going to choose a fixed width, and we can set the width of this frame as the content width on our website. So let's say that's 1280 pixels. You can see it's expanded our frame over here to the right, but it's left our menu kind of floating out here in space. To fix that, we're going to get rid of the space here inside the gap, and we're going to double click over here to change the alignment. You can see when we double click that, we now have this gap set to auto. So this is going to go ahead and just add an auto gap in between our items here. You can see even if we change this back to our services, it's just going to move things over and make sure they still fit, maintaining our gap between items and making sure we still have this auto margin in between the two items. Using auto layouts to set up things like your header definitely makes your designs in Figma a lot more scalable, but it's not limited to just headers. I'll set up entire sections and entire pages using auto layout where I can really dial in the spacing between elements, move things around easier, and maintain a more consistent layout. Now again, we're just scratching the surface with what you can do with auto layouts here in this video, but I'll leave some links down in the description of this video where you can dive a little bit deeper into auto layouts because I know you're going to get a ton out of this feature. Next, let's talk about our color and text styles. This is actually going to work similarly to how you work in websites already. So once you see this feature inside of Figma, I think it's going to be second nature. What we're going to be able to do is go ahead and click on this logo here where we can get this red fill. Let's pretend this is our brand color. So we're going to want to save this to reuse it throughout the entire design and not have to fill in the hex code manually each time. So here on our fill, I'm going to click these 4 dots and I'm going to click the plus button. Here in the style tab, I can give this a name. So I could say brand red, and it's going to go ahead and automatically fill in the hex code here, and we can hit create style. Now when we click on our logo, we can see the fill color is actually brand red, and it doesn't give us all the options to mess with the color. Of course, you can go back and change this. We can click on this brand red and click here to be able to change this property, which we'll do here in just a second. But since we're using the same red over here on our button, let's make sure we're referencing that same color swatch. So I'm going to double click on our button here, and instead of having it filled with the hex code, I'm going to click the 4 buttons, and now I can just click brand red. So now both this logo and this button are both referencing the same red color. This gives us the ability to go ahead and edit that color later. I'll move this down so we can see both of these change in real time. I can click on this and change this color to blue, and it's automatically going to update across everything in my design file where I use this color. Essentially, we're creating color variables, and we can do the same exact thing with text. So here in my menu, you can see I've set up specific styles for our text. This includes the font family, the thickness of the font, the size, and all of the different properties that go into this text. Now, I might want to reuse the same kind of text somewhere else on the website and have that same ability to be able to change it globally later down the road should I change my mind. We can do this through text styles. So here under text, again, I'm going to click the 4 dots and I'll click the plus button to add a new text style. Here, I'll call this menu text and we'll hit create. Later down the road, if we're typing out a footer menu, let's say, and we want to make sure we use that same text style we used in the header menu, we can just click the 4 dots here and click menu text. This is great for setting up things like fonts in your menus, but also your body font, your different headline styles. All of that can be set up using these text styles or variables right here inside of Figma. Setting styles inside of Figma is critical in getting the most out of it, but we can take that a step further by creating components. I'm going to grab this button here and copy and paste it and take it out of our frame so we can work with this. So you've seen how we've been able to take this color and match it to one of our variables, and we've even been able to take text and match this to our text styles. But often we're using multiple styles in one compound element, and that's where components come into play. So I'm going to highlight this entire button and go up here to the top menu to click this Create Component button. Now you can see the frame around this button turned purple, which indicates that it's a component. We can double click the frame here to give this a name, so we'll just call it button. And now we have a button component that's locked in all the styles for all the elements inside of here. So now as we go through our design, when we need a new button, we can click on the Assets tab and just drag in a new button. I'll go ahead and drag in a few different copies of it here so we can see how this is going to be affected when we need to make changes to our button later on. You can see this original copy of our button gets a different icon next to it. This is because this is our master copy of this button, and any changes we make to this copy will affect all the ones we made from it. Let me go ahead and give you an example. Let's say we decided that the padding on this button wasn't quite right. We wanted to change it to 40 pixels and 16 pixels. You can see by changing this master copy, it updated all the other copies here in real time. You can see it if I go back to 32 and 12, all those buttons change. But if we went to one of our copies of this component and made that same change, it would only affect the one we're selecting, not every instance of it. So it's really important to safeguard all your components so you don't accidentally mess them up. For me, I like going here to Pages, adding a new page and calling this Components, and putting all of my components here inside the Components page. I'm just going to use Command X to cut this out, go into my components and paste it in. And here inside this page, I would collect all of my components here, and that way I'm not messing with them as I'm working on the page, but I have a special place to go to them and edit them should I need to down the road. But again, we're just scratching the surface. Not only can we create components, but we can create variants of those components. I'm going to click on our button here, go back to the top menu, and you can see we have this new Add Variant button. I'm going to click on that, and you can see our component now gets a big frame around it. So we have one component and two different variants of that component. I'm going to stretch this frame out a little bit bigger because I'm actually going to make more variants inside of here. So you can see over here on our layers panel, we have our button and we have variant 2 and default. I'm going to go ahead and change these names by double clicking in here, and you can see we have property 1 and then a value. We can change what these properties are and what the values are. So I'm going to do that here by just calling this style, and I'm going to call this primary. What I've done essentially is decided that this is my primary button. Now here, I'm going to click on this button, and we're going to make some changes to it. I'm going to unlock that brand color and maybe make it just a little bit darker. This is going to be the hover state of this button. So now I'll go ahead over into our layers panel, double click on it. And again, I'm going to change this to style, and I'm going to call this primary-hover. So now I have two different variants of this same button. We'll go back into our page here, over to our assets and drag in a button. And now we have these different styles for our button. We can see our component is listed here, and the property we listed, which was style, is listed here with our different versions we made here. We can have our primary and we can have our hover. Now you're probably not going to want to just put a hover state button here in your design, but we'll touch on that and why it's important here in a second. Let's go back over to our components, and we'll click on our first one and go ahead and click this plus button to make another variant. I'm just going to stick it over here to the side, and we're going to make our secondary button. So I'm going to get rid of this color again. Let's say this one's going to be a light gray, and we'll make the text a dark color. And for this button, we can double click over here in our layers, and for the style, we're going to call this secondary. Just like our primary had a hover, let's go ahead and give a hover state to our secondary button. We'll do that by adding another variant and changing whatever properties we want. On this one, let's make it a little bit darker, and we'll say that that's the way our button looks on hover. We need to make sure we name this, so we can go over here to our style, and we'll change this to secondary-hover. You can use whatever naming convention makes sense for you, but this is typically how I would label my buttons. Now when we go back into the page and to our assets, we can drag in a new copy of our button, and under our style, we have primary, primary hover, secondary, and secondary hover. You can actually create multiple different properties here, and I would encourage you to go through YouTube and search for components. There's lots of good tutorials out there that go really deep into all the things you can do with components. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And I know we're just talking about surface level things here, but what I showed you today is probably what you're going to use about 90% of the time. But let's touch again on our components and these hover variants. The reason I created hover states for these is we can actually show interactions here inside of Figma. Right now we're inside the design tab, but if we click here, we can go into our prototype mode. I'm going to click on this first button here, and you can see we have this new little icon that comes up on either side of it. I can click this icon, hold and drag, and you can see I can drag these arrows to other components. I'm going to drag this down to the button below it. Unfortunately, you can't really see it because the UI is hiding it, but now I've connected this button to this button and I get a little pop-up. So now it's asking me, what kind of interaction do I want to create? So on here, I'm going to pull down this menu and select while hovering, and I want to change the style to primary hover. I can change the way it animates. I'm going to choose Smart Animate, and I'm going to choose 250 milliseconds. I'm going to click on this secondary button over here and do the same thing, drag it down, and I'm going to change the style to secondary hover and Smart Animate 250 milliseconds. It remembered what we used before. This is really great because we can go back into our design here. I'm going to delete all these and start fresh. We can drop in a primary button. I'll make a duplicate copy of it here. Go back to our design tab, and I'm going to change this to a secondary button. To be able to preview this, I'm just going to create a frame here, and I'm going to click this play button to preview. Now in preview mode, you can see when I hover over these buttons, they get darker. It's using those interactions we set up to show you that preview on the front end. This is really great for prototyping things for clients so they can see not only the normal state, but the hover state. Like everything inside of Figma, you can take this much further. I've seen people create really complex things using these interactions. It almost feels like you're using the entire website. But for me, most of the time, what I'm doing is just creating hover states on things or navigating from one page to the other. You can use that same system, go into your menu, and with all your different pages you're designing, have it so when somebody clicks the button in your menu, it actually puts them over to that page inside the preview mode. It's a pretty cool way to send different previews to your clients and give them a more realistic view of how their website's going to behave. There are two more really key things I want to show you before we get out of here. The first one is going to be setting up grids. I'm going to go back into our page here, and we can delete this stuff out and we'll start fresh. Usually you're going to start your design with some kind of frame, so I'll click on the frame tool and it gives you a bunch of options over here. Often if I'm designing a website, I'll just grab this MacBook Pro 16-inch. Now we have a pretty plain frame here on the screen, and I want to talk about how you can set up grids on your page that makes it a little bit easier to design to. I'm going to click on this frame, and over here I'm going to click Layout Grid. By default, this is going to give you a small grid. We'll jump into it here and you can see all these lines. But what I actually like to work with are the columns. So you can see here now we have some grid lines that give us columns. These don't actually show up in your design. It's just here for working purposes. Typically what I'll do is a 12 column count. I'll make these pretty transparent, so somewhere around 5%, but here for the purposes of the video, I'm going to leave it at 20 just so you can really see it. We'll leave the type as stretch, and I'm going to change the gutter to 16 pixels since I'm usually working on an 8-point system. Now the last thing we need to do is set up the margin. So right now you can see our frame is set up to 1728 pixels. But I'll usually set some kind of container width on my website. So we're going to have to do a little bit of math to set up this margin. Here in my calculator, I'm going to take that 1728, which is the width of our frame right now, and I'm going to subtract 1280, which is typically the content width I have on websites. That leaves us with 448, which I can then divide by 2 so I can get my size for either side. What I'll need is 224 pixels on the left and 224 pixels on the right. So we'll close this calculator and we'll add 224 as the margin. So now you can see we kind of have our content width set up here and 12 columns inside of it. This means when I'm setting up new sections, I might want to only span the headline from this end to this end because I know that's where my content is going to end each side. Figma does a pretty good job of recognizing these grids you've put in here and snapping things to it. And using grids in your design definitely makes things more cohesive and flow quite a bit better. So I'd really encourage you to get used to using a grid as you're designing in Figma. Okay, the last item I want to touch in today's video is dev mode, which is really powerful for when you go from the design to actually developing out your projects. Figma does a great job of hand-holding developers too. You remember we were in design mode most of the time. We did go over into prototype mode, but we also have the option to go here into dev mode. So if we click this toggle, we've now changed the interface to be in dev mode, and things changed a little bit. If you look here at this toolbar, I'll toggle back and forth. Here in design mode, we have all of our different tools, but in dev mode, we're limited to fewer tools. Now, this does show that it's in beta mode, but for me, I've been using this for quite a while and had really good success. Here, you can change the language that you're using and the unit that you're using. In fact, let's just go ahead and change that to rem. Now, when I click on this button, instead of all the design controls over here, I get a bunch of development things. So I can see things like the padding, all here in rem, since that's what I selected for this element. And I can see all the CSS properties here, including the display, padding, justification of the content, aligning items, gap, background color, all of that information is included. So this is really handy if you're doing designs and handing them over to a developer. A developer can get in here and look in dev mode to grab all the things they need. But I'll even use this myself if I'm designing and developing. It just makes it quicker and easier to be able to see the different styles in the appropriate language. Instead of in design speak, we can actually see this in developer talk, where we have the different properties and values here in CSS. It's really handy, and I would encourage you to take advantage of this feature as you're developing out your websites. I've put links down in the description to some of my favorite creators here on YouTube that do Figma content. I've poured over hours of Figma content to get to where I am, and I imagine you're going to have to spend a lot of time doing the same. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive tutorial on how to use everything inside of Figma, but hopefully it got your mind going a little bit about the different possibilities. Things like auto layout and components go really, really deep, and there are some great video tutorials here on YouTube that will tell you all the ins and outs about them. Of course, sitting and watching videos is one thing. Where you're really going to get the most education is by putting these things into practice. So I would encourage you to spend a little bit of extra time as you're starting to get to know Figma to try to use all of these things. That muscle memory that you build in actually using them is going to help you out a whole lot more than watching tutorials ever will. If you learned something from this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch my next one, go ahead and hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.